You may know Chris Sarandon without realizing how many times you have already met him. He was Jerry Dandridge, the unnervingly charming vampire in Fright Night. He was Prince Humperdinck in The Princess Bride, smiling politely while arranging murder and war. He was the speaking voice of Jack Skellington in The Nightmare Before Christmas. And years before any of those roles, in his first feature film, he played Leon opposite Al Pacino in Dog Day Afternoon and earned an Academy Award nomination. Those performances barely seemed to belong to the same actor. That was part of Sarandon's gift. He could look romantic enough to play a leading man, then use the same face to make a villain feel civilized, wounded, funny, or dangerous. But there was a point when none of that future seemed certain. In his 30s, after making a horror film called The Sentinel for director Michael Winner, Sarandon came away so disturbed by the experience that he seriously considered quitting acting. He left the United States, traveled alone to East Africa, drove himself through game reserves, and slept in huts for 3 weeks. There was no crew around him, no publicity tour, and no new role waiting at the end of the road. He later described the trip as something he needed in order to clear the experience out of his system. That is the strange contradiction at the center of Chris Sarandon's career. One horror film made him want to leave the profession. Another, 8 years later, would give him one of the roles people still stop him to talk about. And the road between those two films begins a long way from Hollywood, in Beckley, West Virginia. Christopher Sarandon Jr. was born in Beckley on July 24, 1942, into a Greek immigrant family. His parents ran a restaurant, and like many family businesses, it required everyone to help. Chris grew up working around customers, food, conversation, and the practical demands of keeping a place running. He also grew up between cultures. Greek belonged to family life. English belonged to the wider world around him. That background stayed important to him, but Beckley gave him another identity as well: performer. At Woodrow Wilson High School, Sarandon was student council president and a working teenage musician. He played drums and sang backup with a rock and roll group called the Teen Tones. The band did more than rehearse in somebody's garage. They performed and backed touring musicians, giving Sarandon an early education in timing, audiences, and the discipline of supporting whoever stood at the front of the stage. He went on to West Virginia University, studied speech and drama, and graduated magna cum laude. Graduate training brought him to the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C. That is where he met a younger actress named Susan Tomlin. Most viewers know her by the name she kept after their marriage, Susan Sarandon. That connection still surprises people because their careers eventually became so separate that many assumed the shared surname meant they were brother and sister, or simply unrelated actors with the same last name. In fact, Chris and Susan married in 1967, when both were still young performers trying to establish themselves. Their early life together was not glamorous. Chris worked in regional theater, touring productions, daytime television, and Broadway. He played Dr. Tom Halverson on The Guiding Light. Between acting jobs, he did the kind of practical work actors do when a career has not yet become a living, including driving trucks and working lighting rigs. He appeared on Broadway in The Rothschilds and later played Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet. Susan's career was beginning to move too. They were two actors entering the same business at roughly the same time, without knowing whose opportunities would arrive first or how quickly their paths would separate. For Chris, the decisive opportunity came in 1975. He had never acted in a feature film before. Sidney Lumet was preparing Dog Day Afternoon with Al Pacino, and Sarandon was offered a supporting role that could easily have become a stereotype. Instead, it became the performance that established him. Dog Day Afternoon was based on a real 1972 bank robbery in Brooklyn that turned into a prolonged hostage standoff surrounded by police, television crews, reporters, and onlookers. Al Pacino played Sonny Wartzik, the fictionalized robber. Chris Sarandon played Leon Shermer, Sonny's partner, whose need for gender-affirming surgery was tied to the motive behind the robbery. For an actor making his film debut in 1975, Leon was not a safe role. Sarandon understood how easily the character could be reduced to mannerisms. He did not want to play a joke, and he did not want to build Leon from the cliches that mainstream audiences of the period would already recognize, so he went looking for people rather than gestures. A gay actor he knew introduced him to 4 people who shared experiences that could help him understand the character. Sarandon invited them to his apartment, made spaghetti, sat with them, and asked about their lives. He wanted their histories, when they first understood themselves, how other people treated them, what they feared, and what they wanted. One story stayed with him for decades. A woman told him that as a child, she had watched King Kong, seen Fay Wray on the screen, and thought, "I want to be her." Sarandon remembered that because it gave him something more useful than an acting trick. It gave him a childhood image, a private point of recognition that existed before the adult world had a label for it. Those conversations also changed the way he saw the people sitting in front of him. He later recalled realizing that he had stopped analyzing one of the women as somebody presenting herself a certain way. He simply saw an attractive young woman and caught himself flirting with her. That shift mattered to the performance. Leon stopped being an idea Sarandon had to demonstrate and became a person he had to understand. The remarkable thing is how little screen time he needed to make that understanding register. Sarandon and Pacino's central exchange takes place over a telephone. Sonny is inside the bank. Leon is outside, brought into the crisis by police. They are physically separated, so the relationship has to exist entirely through 2 voices, 2 faces, and the history the actors can suggest without sharing the same space. The scene could have begun at full emotional volume. Instead, during rehearsal, Pacino and Sarandon looked for the habits of people who had known each other intimately. Before the anger, there is concern. Before the argument, there is familiarity. The conversation feels less like 2 characters explaining a plot and more like 2 people falling into a pattern they have probably repeated before. That restraint is one reason Leon stayed with viewers. Many people who rediscover Dog Day Afternoon today are surprised when they realize the actor is Chris Sarandon. The fragile, exhausted Leon does not immediately resemble Jerry Dandridge or Prince Humperdinck. Some viewers remember the character vividly but never connected the face to the later roles. That contrast is a useful measure of Sarandon's range. His own nerves helped him get there. He was auditioning for Sidney Lumet and reading opposite Al Pacino, with no film career behind him. Sarandon later remembered the physical anxiety of the experience: dry mouth, tension, the fear that he might lose control of the audition. Instead of pretending that fear did not exist, he found a place for it in Leon. The result was extraordinary for a first film. Sarandon received an Academy Award nomination for Best Supporting Actor. Yet the nomination did not turn him into the kind of star Hollywood might have expected him to become. He had the looks for conventional romantic leads, but he found those roles less interesting than damaged men, villains, and characters who made the audience uneasy. That choice helps explain why his career can look, from a distance, smaller than his talent. He repeatedly stepped away from the safest lane available to him. His next films made that obvious. In Lipstick, released in 1976, he played a soft-spoken music teacher who commits a brutal sexual assault. The movie was controversial, and the scene was deliberately difficult to watch. Sarandon's defense was straightforward. The violence was supposed to be unbearable. He was willing to play someone repellent if the ugliness belonged to the story. Then came The Sentinel. On paper, it looked like another step upward. Sarandon had a prominent role, good money, and his name carried more weight after Dog Day Afternoon. He knew the screenplay was strange, but actors accept projects for many reasons, and this one appeared to be a conventional leading man opportunity inside a supernatural horror film. The problem was not the supernatural material. The problem, Sarandon later said, was director Michael Winner. The Sentinel was released in 1977, during the wave of supernatural horror that followed The Exorcist. Sarandon played Michael Lerman, and the film eventually pushed his character into increasingly grotesque territory. Years later, he could joke about the plot. He was far less amused by the atmosphere in which the movie was made. Sarandon described Michael Winner as caustic and malevolent. The memory that appears to have affected him most came from the film's climax, which used performers with real physical disabilities and amputations as part of a procession of the damned. Sarandon did not object simply because those performers had been cast. What disturbed him was the way, in his account, Winner treated and mocked people on the set. For an actor who had just spent so much effort on Dog Day Afternoon trying to see a character as a complete human being instead of a spectacle, the experience landed badly. He could tolerate darkness in a story. He had chosen dark material deliberately. What he found difficult was watching cruelty become part of the working environment itself. By the end of the production, he was questioning more than one movie. He was questioning the profession. Sarandon later said he almost quit acting. Instead of moving directly into another job, he left for East Africa alone. For 3 weeks, he drove through game reserves, watched animals, and slept in huts. He called it a walkabout, a way to flush the experience out of his system. This is the answer to the image at the beginning of the story. The man driving alone through Africa was not running from a failed career. Dog Day Afternoon had made him an Oscar nominee. He was not escaping poverty or obscurity. He was getting distance from a successful Hollywood production that had made success feel less attractive. He eventually returned to the United States feeling able to work again, but he stayed away from horror for 8 years. That gap matters because Sarandon did not decide that horror itself was corrupting or worthless. He continued taking complicated roles. In 1980, he played Jesus in the television film The Day Christ Died. Around the same period, he took on 2 roles in A Tale of Two Cities, playing both Sidney Carton and Charles Darnay, men who look alike but occupy very different moral and emotional positions in the story. He also proved he could work in lighter material, including Protocol, opposite Goldie Hawn. The career was alive. What had changed was his relationship to the kind of set he was willing to endure. Then, in 1985, writer-director Tom Holland offered him another horror film. This time, the character was a vampire. Sarandon agreed, and Jerry Dandridge became the role that a large part of his audience would remember first. Fright Night begins with an idea simple enough for a teenager to understand immediately and impossible for the adults around him to believe. The charming man who has moved in next door is a vampire. Chris Sarandon plays that man, Jerry Dandridge. The casting works because Jerry does not enter the story looking like a monster. He is attractive, confident, well-dressed, composed, and old enough to understand exactly how much power those qualities give him. He can smile at an adult and appear reasonable. He can look at a teenager and make the threat perfectly clear without raising his voice. Sarandon had spent years avoiding conventional heartthrob roles because he thought they were boring. Jerry Dandridge allowed him to use the same tools in a more interesting way. Charm became camouflage. Sexual confidence became intimidation. Good manners made the danger worse because Jerry could move through ordinary suburban life without looking like something that needed to be stopped. That combination is what viewers still respond to. For some fans, Fright Night is the first image that appears when they hear Sarandon's name. Others remember seeing the film as teenagers and developing a crush on the villain, which is exactly the uneasy reaction the performance is designed to create. Jerry is frightening because attraction and danger are operating at the same time. The role also has special weight in Sarandon's personal history. 8 years earlier, The Sentinel had made him want to abandon acting. Fright Night brought him back into horror under completely different circumstances. Tom Holland's film treated the genre with affection. It understood old vampire movies, television horror hosts, teenage fear, and the pleasure of watching familiar rules collide with modern suburbia. Sarandon was not trapped inside a production he wanted to escape. He was part of a movie that knew horror could be frightening and playful at the same time. That difference seems to have mattered. Jerry Dandridge is also a good example of the kind of actor Sarandon had become. He rarely makes the performance busier than it needs to be. Jerry often behaves as though he has already won. He does not need to prove he is powerful every second, because certainty is part of the character's power. Even his most memorable lines work because Sarandon allows the threat to arrive through control rather than noise. Fright Night became a hit and developed an even stronger life after its theatrical run, especially on home video. People watched it repeatedly, passed tapes around, and came back to it as one of the defining horror films of the 1980s. Decades later, fans still quote Jerry Dandridge to Sarandon at conventions. The film also created a professional connection with Tom Holland. 3 years later, Holland cast Sarandon again in Child's Play, this time as Detective Mike Norris, the police officer who becomes involved in the story of a killer doll named Chucky. By then, Sarandon had done something unusual. He had gone from nearly quitting after one horror film to appearing in 2 movies that would become long-running reference points for horror fans. Yet Fright Night was only part of his remarkable run through the second half of the 1980s. In 1987, he joined the cast of The Princess Bride. If Jerry Dandridge is the role many horror fans remember first, Prince Humperdinck may be the role that introduced Sarandon to everyone else. Humperdinck is another villain built around control. He is vain, calculating, and willing to have Buttercup murdered in order to create the political result he wants. But Sarandon does not play him as a raging tyrant. Much of the humor comes from how matter-of-factly the prince conducts his villainy, as if murder, marriage, and war are simply items on a schedule. Sarandon remembered making The Princess Bride as one of the happier experiences of his career. He recalled joking with Christopher Guest, bringing his daughters to meet Andre the Giant, eating with the cast, playing games, and singing doo-wop songs together. After the experience of The Sentinel, the contrast is hard to miss. Some sets had made him question the profession. This one felt, in his memory, closer to a summer camp for actors. The movie's reputation grew over time. Sarandon liked telling a story about a woman who carried a VHS copy with her so she could show it to friends who had somehow missed the film. He called her an evangelist for The Princess Bride. That kind of devotion explains why viewers who may not know Sarandon's name still recognize Humperdinck immediately. Then came another surprise. In 1993, Sarandon became the speaking voice of Jack Skellington in The Nightmare Before Christmas. Danny Elfman provided Jack's singing voice, while Sarandon handled the spoken dialogue. Even people who grew up with the film sometimes discover that connection only years later. By this point, his career had produced a strange collection of characters that seemed to live longer than ordinary hits. Leon, Jerry Dandridge, Humperdinck, Mike Norris, Jack Skellington. Sarandon had not followed a conventional plan for stardom. He had followed roles that interested him, and several of those roles became more durable than careers built around much bigger billing. But while the films were accumulating a second life with audiences, Sarandon's private life was entering a period of instability that had nothing to do with reviews or box office numbers. He was about to lose almost everything he had saved. Before that financial collapse, it is worth pausing over what Sarandon had actually built. He was never simply the actor from Fright Night, although generations of horror fans understandably think of him that way. He had already been an Oscar nominee. He could move between film, television, Broadway, comedy, literary drama, horror, and voice work. He could play Leon with exposed vulnerability and then, a decade later, make Jerry Dandridge frightening by barely seeming to try. That range is one reason viewers so often have the same reaction when they revisit his films. Wait, that was Chris Sarandon too? A Tale of Two Cities produced that response for many people who remember him playing Sidney Carton and Charles Darnay. Child's Play surprises viewers who associate him only with the vampire next door. Jack Skellington surprises people who assumed the speaking and singing voices came from the same performer. And Dog Day Afternoon continues to surprise audiences who know Sarandon from his later, more polished villains but do not immediately recognize the nervous, wounded Leon. There is a pattern in those discoveries. Sarandon's career did not depend on making every character feel like Chris Sarandon. The roles often concealed the actor rather than advertise him. That may also explain why some viewers feel he should have been a much larger star. He had the face of a leading man and enough range to carry very different kinds of material, but he had little interest in building a career around being the same attractive man in one movie after another. The parts he chose were often supporting roles, villains, strange men, difficult men, or characters whose most useful quality was that the audience could not immediately decide what to make of them. There were costs to that choice. Stardom rewards repetition more often than actors like to admit. Audiences have to know what they are buying. Sarandon seemed more interested in finding out what else he could do. His personal life was changing at the same time. He and Susan Sarandon separated in 1975 and divorced in 1979. Sarandon later described the breakup without turning it into a feud. Their lives had diverged. In 1980, he married model Lisa Ann Cooper. They had 3 children, Stephanie, Alexis, and Michael. That marriage ended in 1989. The same period brought a financial crisis that Sarandon could not solve by simply taking a few months away from Hollywood. He had spent years doing what working actors are usually told to do when the money is good, save for the years when it is not. He invested heavily in Manhattan brownstones with a business partner. According to Sarandon, the partner turned out to be a fraud. Because Sarandon was legally tied to the mortgages, he was left exposed when the arrangement collapsed. The savings he had accumulated across years of work disappeared into the disaster. His own summary was simple. He lost everything. The timing could hardly have been worse. His second marriage was ending. The money he had put aside for later life had to be liquidated, and he still had a family and ordinary expenses. So the actor who had once rejected safe roles because he found them boring entered a period when artistic preference mattered less than employment. Sarandon had a name for some of the projects he accepted then: mortgage movies. He had to work. He had to pay the rent. That is an important part of his story because it strips away the illusion that an Oscar nomination, a hit horror film, and a beloved fairy tale automatically create permanent financial security. Sarandon had recognizable credits and a long resume, yet one fraudulent investment could still force him back into survival mode. And then, while he was already dealing with that, Broadway gave him one of the most public failures of his career. The show was Nick and Nora. On paper, Nick and Nora looked almost impossible to fail. The musical was based on Dashiell Hammett's Thin Man characters and arrived with an established creative team. Arthur Laurents wrote and directed. Charles Strouse composed the music. Richard Maltby Jr. wrote the lyrics. Joanna Gleason, already a Tony-winning performer, starred as Nora Charles. Barry Bostwick played Nick. Chris Sarandon joined the cast at a moment when he needed work badly. Instead of becoming a major Broadway success, the production became famous for its problems before it even officially opened. Nick and Nora went through 71 preview performances over roughly 9 weeks. The material kept changing. Songs were added and removed. The opening was delayed. The problems became part of Broadway conversation, while the cast still had to walk into the theater and perform the show every night. It finally opened at the Marquis Theater on December 8, 1991. The reviews were brutal. 1 week later, after only 9 official performances, the production closed. Sarandon later called this period the worst time of his life. That description makes sense when the events are placed beside each other. He had been defrauded and lost the savings he had built for his future. His marriage to Cooper had ended. Now he was standing inside a Broadway production whose failure was public, expensive, and impossible to hide. But one person beside him understood the absurdity of it just as well as he did. Joanna Gleason had been living through the same collapsing production. She later described Nick and Nora with the image of a mushroom cloud hanging over the theater. It is funny because there is not much else to do with a disaster that complete. Sarandon and Gleason became a couple. When the show was over, the professional failure did not disappear. The lost money did not return. The reviews did not improve, but something had changed in Sarandon's life that would outlast all of it. He and Gleason went west, resumed working, and married in 1994. Sarandon has described meeting her as the beginning of his third life. The phrase is useful because the first two lives had been defined by ambition and disruption. The young actor from Beckley became an Oscar nominee, married Susan, divorced, built another family, found cult film success, and then watched financial security collapse. The third life was less dramatic from the outside and much more stable from the inside. Sarandon continued acting through the 1990s and 2000s. He appeared on television in shows including ER, Charmed, Judging Amy, and Law & Order Special Victims Unit. He returned to Broadway in The Light in the Piazza and continued appearing on stage in later productions, including Cyrano de Bergerac and Preludes. He and Gleason also worked together over the years, allowing marriage and professional life to overlap without one swallowing the other. There was still difficult material in his career. Playwright Susan Rice asked him to direct Not Someone Like Me, a work built from the experiences of women who had survived sexual assault. Sarandon initially questioned whether a woman should direct it instead. Rice's answer was that the audience she most wanted to reach was men. He accepted. The project has an obvious connection to Lipstick, where Sarandon had once played the perpetrator in a deliberately disturbing sexual assault sequence. Decades later, his role was behind the scenes, helping present survivors' experiences directly to audiences. Yet by this stage, acting itself was no longer the center of everything. Sarandon had already survived the moment when he wanted to quit in Africa. He had survived financial ruin. He had survived a Broadway flop spectacular enough to become theater lore. What came next was not a comeback in the usual Hollywood sense. It was a quieter life that, judging by the way Sarandon talks about it, may have suited him better. As Sarandon grew older, he kept working, but the hunger that had driven the early career began to fade. He has said that he still receives offers and turns many of them down because he no longer feels the same fire to keep acting simply for the sake of staying visible. His original goal, as he describes it, was to have a career. He did not set out to become famous. By that standard, the goal had been met many times over. The later version of Sarandon's life centered increasingly on Connecticut, his marriage to Joanna Gleason, his children, and a large garden he began to treat almost like another profession. That image is far removed from the usual story people tell about actors who disappear from major screens. Audiences often assume that if they stop seeing somebody regularly, Hollywood rejected them, the career collapsed, or some hidden scandal must explain the absence. Sarandon's story is less dramatic and more recognizable. Work changed. Priorities changed. The desire to keep competing changed. During the COVID lockdown, when theaters closed and film production slowed, he found another way to use the curiosity that had always shaped his acting. He started a podcast called Cooking by Heart. The format is built around food and memory. Guests talk about meals, family traditions, kitchens, childhood, and the people attached to those memories. In a way, it brings Sarandon back to where he started, a family restaurant in West Virginia, conversation around food, and the belief that the useful story is often hidden behind what somebody first tells you about themselves. There is also an echo of Dog Day Afternoon in it. As a young actor preparing for Leon, Sarandon invited people over, cooked spaghetti, and listened to their histories because he wanted to understand lives that were not his own. Decades later, listening over food became the entire structure of his show. That podcast eventually created one of the most unexpected closing chapters in his personal story. For many years, Chris and Susan Sarandon had little contact. Their careers had separated long ago, and Susan had become so closely associated with the surname that younger audiences often had no idea where it came from. Then they reconnected. In 2023, Susan appeared with Chris at a live event connected to Cooking by Heart. Two people who had met as young actors in Washington were sitting together in front of an audience more than half a century later, talking about who they had been before anyone knew either of them. The significance was not that two famous ex-spouses could share a stage without hostility. It was what Susan remembered about him. When Susan Sarandon looked back on their youth, She did not focus on awards or career strategy. She remembered Chris introducing her to black and white films and literature. She remembered believing that he knew everything. More importantly, she credited his kindness with helping give her a foundation at a vulnerable point in her life. For a story full of vampires, villains, demons, bank robbers, failed musicals, divorce, fraud, and an actor driving alone through Africa, that is an unexpectedly simple place to arrive. It also fits the way many people describe Sarandon after meeting him. Fans who have encountered him at horror conventions often talk less about celebrity than about how approachable he was. Some remember discussing Greek heritage with him. Others remember him taking time to speak to them rather than treating the autograph table like an assembly line. People who knew only the polished menace of Jerry Dandridge or the smug Prince Humperdinck were surprised to find a man they experienced as warm, thoughtful, and unpretentious. There is something satisfying about that contrast, but it also explains why Sarandon was so effective as a villain. A performer does not have to resemble the person he plays. In Sarandon's case, the distance may have helped. Jerry Dandridge works because Sarandon understands charm well enough to turn it threatening. Humperdinck works because he can make cruelty sound civilized. Leon works for the opposite reason. He does not stand outside the character and ask the audience to observe somebody strange. He moves inward and looks for the ordinary human emotions underneath the circumstances. That approach produced a career that viewers keep rediscovering in pieces. Some people first knew him as Leon in Dog Day Afternoon and were shocked years later to realize he was the vampire in Fright Night. Others grew up with The Princess Bride and never knew Prince Humperdinck had also voiced Jack Skellington. Horror fans followed him from The Sentinel to Fright Night to Child's Play. Television viewers remember A Tale of Two Cities or one of his many guest appearances. The recurring reaction is not simply, "I forgot about Chris Sarandon." It is, "I didn't realize that was him too." Perhaps that is the best way to understand why his career feels both famous and strangely underappreciated. Sarandon never became the kind of star whose personality overwhelmed every role. He also made choices that did not maximize conventional stardom. After Dog Day Afternoon, he could have pursued safer romantic leads. Instead, he moved toward uncomfortable characters and villains. When a working environment became intolerable, he left the country for 3 weeks rather than convincing himself that success required accepting anything. When he lost his savings, he swallowed his pride and took jobs because the rent still had to be paid. When Nick and Nora collapsed, the failure became the place where he met Joanna Gleason. And when the desire to act began fading, he did not treat visibility as an obligation. He gardened, he cooked, he talked to people. He stayed married to Joanna for decades. He rebuilt a friendship with Susan, and the woman who had known him before Dog Day Afternoon, before the Oscar nomination, before Fright Night and The Princess Bride, returned late in his life and publicly remembered him for something no review could measure: kindness. That does not turn every career choice into a moral lesson, and it does not erase the difficult periods. Sarandon lost relationships. He lost money. He took work he would not otherwise have chosen. He spent part of his 30s wondering whether the profession he had worked years to enter was worth staying in. But he stayed long enough to leave behind an unusually durable collection of performances. Leon is still vulnerable and alive on that telephone with Pacino. Jerry Dandridge still walks into a room and makes danger look elegant. Prince Humperdinck is still quoted by families who have watched The Princess Bride until they know every beat. Jack Skellington still speaks with Sarandon's voice every Halloween and Christmas, even to viewers who never knew whose voice they were hearing. And somewhere behind all those characters is the young man from a restaurant in Beckley who wanted a career more than fame. He got the career. Fame arrived in an irregular way, attached to films that kept finding new audiences long after their original releases. The darker episodes never disappeared, but neither did they define the ending. The actor who once drove alone through East Africa because he needed distance from Hollywood eventually built a life in which Hollywood no longer had to be the center of everything. Maybe that is why the ending feels so much better than a conventional comeback. He did not have to conquer the industry that disappointed him. He simply had to decide how much of his life it was allowed to occupy. And for Chris Sarandon, the answer seems to have become only as much as he still wanted to give it. Thanks for watching. Let me know which Chris Sarandon role you recognized first. Leon, Jerry Dandridge, Prince Humperdinck, Jack Skellington, or somebody else entirely. Until next time.